Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be back in the Whitla Hall. I was last here 12 years ago, sitting there graduating as a social worker. And the main speaker on that day was telling us about how great our achievement was and giving us an idea of the responsibility that we had in working with children and families and keeping them safe. And it was at that moment that a 2-year-old ran from the back all the way up to the front, kicking, screaming and leaping. And he had a bit of a Mexican standoff with the main speaker. And the main speaker had to ask for the child's parents to come and collect him. And as I peered up over my peers, it turned out to be my own son. So there was a Mexican standoff then between me and my wife. I was buried in that lot, and she was at the back. She was too embarrassed to come and get him. And it was my mother, his granny, that stood up and made eye contact with him, and he quickly scuttled off back. So it was a good early show in kind of wider family coming up with solutions to fix a problem. So just a little bit of background on myself. After I graduated, I was a family and childcare social worker in the Lisburn Family Intervention Team for 2 years. At that time, Think Child, Think Parent and Family was in its infancy. And basically, unfortunately, due to a time of transition in that team and challenges as we probably still face today, I didn't see a great deal of that, or didn't have an opportunity to have that embedded in my practice at that time. When I moved to the Belfast Trust in 2012, I was lucky that it coincided with the start of the Think Family Champions, and because of my experience, my manager put me forward immediately for the Think Family Champions. So I've been part of that for 10 years in the Belfast Trust, and I'll touch on some of that today. About 4 years ago, I got the chance to become Social Work Development Lead with Think Family in the Belfast Trust, and again, with my colleagues in other trust areas, we'll talk about the wider work, but the reason I'm here today is to kind of focus on the direct work with children using the family model. So the reason I include this slide, you've probably seen it before, is that we created this for a pilot that we run in the Acute Mental Health Inpatient Centre, just like a visual thing for professionals. But the young lady, the young girl I'm about to give an example of this work with, there was a distrust with services, and we needed to be open and upfront with her from the very start. And we didn't want her to be suspicious of any ulterior motives. So we used the model and the explanation. She was a very intelligent young woman, and basically this was very helpful. So helping her to increase her understanding of adult mental illness and to increase her resilience. And that was the goal of our work with her, not for her to stop taking risk-taking behaviours. It wasn't from a risk focus, it was from the Think Family approach. And part of it was in what we also met with her mother early on in the stage to go through these things about improving parental understanding, improving family communication, and as I'll touch on, building trust and finding family-focused or community-based solutions was really key to the work that we did. So the criteria for family model work that we had at that time was children or young people between 5 and 18 who have a parent or siblings with mental health diagnosis, and where the parental illness is deemed to be significantly impacting on the child and family relationships. So in this case, it was referred by a residential worker who had identified, who was a champion, and identified that the work would be very beneficial for one of her service users, and so it turned out to be. So we got parental consent from Chloe, the family have agreed. They were hoping to be here today, but unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances, they couldn't make it. But they have previously produced a video for us. They've both given consent for their family, for their family model work with us to be shared with professionals in order to help train and inform others in its use and of the beneficial outcomes. So we're very grateful to them for both taking part in the video and also giving consent for that, for their case to be used. So the model here, I'm just flagging that up. You've all seen it before, but I'm just going to say, like, as I'm talking through the next couple of slides, if you have the model in front of you, you'll be able to see Dr. Falco has talked at length about the interconnected arrows, how they work between each other, and that was really evident in this case, as I hope to show in a couple of minutes. So, and this was Chloe was 15 at the time that she started this work, and we showed her this model. There was potential that it was risk. It could flood her with kind of the visuals of it, and she wouldn't understand. But she really bought into it from the very start. The destigmatizing nature of it, seeing the all-encompassing surround the circumstances of it. That was just she was a very intelligent girl, and then she was very perceptive of that, and that helped us in the later run. And again, I've included the family model conversation. The relaxed and informal nature of this work was just so powerful. If you think of our young people and people who are engaging with either LAC reviews or child protection case conferences over the last couple of decades, that it can be quite a very formal, very power imbalanced situation. And giving people the space to have a conversation about mental health from a safe space was just unbelievably powerful for Chloe, for reasons I'll go into now. So talking through this gave reassurance to Chloe and her mother that this work was going to be constructive. It was going to hopefully address power imbalances, and people were going to feel comfortable and get benefit from it. Again, this is another thing that we've used, the leaflets developed by the Children and Young People Strategic Partnership. These have proved invaluable for Chloe, but also for other children and service users that have been, particularly parents, that when parents read that themselves, they see how the information is being shared with their children. They're often very concerned that information is going to be shared with their children that is going to lead to them being judged or criticised by their children, or that it's going to cause more harm than good. So when they actually see these leaflets produced and see the language and the terminology, it's a very powerful and beneficial resource for us to have in preparation for using the family model. So just to give a little synopsis on the case. So the family and parents in this case, there was parental mental ill health was an issue for both parents, and there was a lack of engagement with services. It hadn't got to a crisis point until the point that it did, and in the early stages of their mental health issues, they had not sought support that would have led to them coming into adult mental health services. So there was adult mental health issues for both parents, and an adult sibling was engaged in substance use, which could have been quite catastrophic. So there was risk of death through misadventure. So there was wider family conflict and complex dynamics for the family experience, including intergenerational trauma, which was troubles related. There was including the death of a grandparent in the family home when one of the parents was a child. So those childhood bereavements, those intergenerational aspects, so intergenerational trauma and then intergenerational mental health issues was having an impact on this family. As I said, part of the aims of the model and Think Family approach is to increase insight into the impact of parental mental health. There were deficits with regards to that, to the impact on the parenting and on the children. And again, to touch on something that was said elsewhere, it was Chloe who'd engaged with this work and her mother. And the mother, when we met with her, she spoke about the burnout from the additional caring roles that had fallen upon her as a woman and a mother and a daughter. And all of those additional caring roles had helped contribute to burnout and then ultimately concerns of neglect and unmet need for the children. And this led to the children entering care. The parents subsequently separated, and I just include that because it's relevant to how Chloe engages. So there's 3 children, 1 adult sibling, 15-year-old girl Chloe at that time, and a younger brother with a diagnosis of ASD. After the crisis in respect of neglect and the children entering care, there was kind of different approaches for both because of different levels of need. So the brother was placed in long-term foster care in a different trust area. Chloe was struggling with the trauma of separation from her family, concern for her parents' mental well-being and safety, an intense wish to return home to her mother, and anger at family and childcare impacting on her own engagement with support services. Chloe was developing her own mental health difficulties, including self-harm, and she was a risk in terms of vulnerability and risk, her own risk behaviours and self-harm, as she'll talk about later in the video. There were the AWOLs from her residential home, and there was generally a lack of trust in mental health services for not helping her parents. So again, I've touched on the children's different needs. So again, with regards to the model, the preparation work with Chloe was about putting her at ease, helping her tune in to the informal nature of the work. So we would have met in a family centre, but it would have been with a Burger King. Chloe swinging back on a chair. She picked her own coloured pens, smelly pens as well, they had some fragrance off them. And she would feel very relaxed coming into the session. She was clearly able to see it was different to other engagements that she might have with services. So from the outset, we'd explained the model to her. I'm not sure how much of that you can see. So we basically asked, with Chloe having been explained about the model, we asked her to kind of pick which area she wanted to talk about first. So she immediately just went to drawing her family and the big circle around her. As we were going through, the anger towards family and childcare services was evident from the outset. She felt comfortable in expressing that, but very quickly we identified that the best way of approaching this, now we had 5 or 6 different versions of that with different approaches over the first couple initial weeks, but we ultimately settled on Chloe setting her goal of getting back to live with her mother. So that quickly materialised. So in terms of the parent and family relationships in the centre here, this quickly became a discussion on how things were for her at that time. So she described her brother being in care in a different trust area. She described her mum and dad separating in quite passive terms. And she was able to talk about how contact in the other trust area entailed her dad picking up her mum and picking up Chloe and driving to the train station. The family then enjoyed those little, quite by accident rather than design, the family enjoyed those sessions so much that they started doing that separately to the contact. So if they were seeing the younger brother on a fortnightly or monthly basis, they realised the benefits of meeting up together, and they started repairing their family relationship outside of the crisis. As when we touched on, we were trying to link the goals. So Chloe, in terms of child and mental health and development, Chloe described intense anger and an inability to deal with it. She was able to reflect back that she was once able to deal with anger, but currently wasn't. So we tried to take a goals-focused approach with her, and if her goal was to return home to mum, so she talked there about lack reviews, make me angry because of certain things said. And when we teased that out, it was the format of the lack reviews whereby the reasons they came into care were stated first. And Chloe would attend the lack reviews and she would view this as her mum being kicked when she was down and she couldn't stand it, and then she would use an expletive, throw papers across the table and storm out. So part of what we did was trying to work with her with that. So we identified it with the goal of getting home to her mum, and where that decision would be made would likely be a lack review. So we tried to support her in terms of a plan in writing a letter to express her views, skipping the first part of the lack review and then going in at a later stage. So again, this was how we focused on things. When she was able to identify that her brother had additional needs to herself, and that the care placement for her brother was working well, her own caring roles became evident, that she talked about how much she'd had to care for her younger brother when they were living in the family home, and that she was grateful that his care needs were being met. So we helped her to see that children's services had had a positive impact on her family, on her family's well-being and positive outcomes. That had taken such a weight off her mind not to have to worry about her 8-year-old brother. And then in terms of the goals of getting home and her own relationship with children's services, we asked her to think about other positives. So she's able to then reflect on the fact that they had taught her to be independent and managing her own self-care. They taught her how to cook. So suddenly the protective factors came into play, whereby Chloe was able to identify protective factors, resilience. So she was able to identify her strengths, keeping herself safe, and that was in relation to AWOLs, that if she was staying out late at night and police were being called in a review period 6 times, then the family and childcare services were going to feel it was maybe less likely that her mother could meet her needs as a 15-year-old girl at that time. Chloe was very perceptive and very aware of that. So over the piece, this is maybe 4 or 5 weeks' work of her identifying protective factors or risk factors, either her writing herself or myself writing. So the mother, in this case Angela, had suggested that Chloe wasn't really aware of her mum's mental health issues or parents' mental health issues. However, a very powerful moment was Chloe identifying the warning signs and relapse indicators that Chloe herself had identified with her mother. And the mother, again, with regards to attitudes towards family and childcare services, had maybe felt that at times that there was a lack of understanding about all the additional caring roles she had. It was very powerful when Chloe's own words on how she noticed her mum becoming unwell were put to her, and there was an agreed plan that, that she would agree to speak to a GP if people raised concerns, and that included Chloe. And Chloe had, got an intense feeling of satisfaction that she could, in the future, be a support for her mum in her mum's mental health from a more strength-based position for herself. So when we spoke about adult services, again, initially there was a feeling of anger towards adult services, that they had let her parents down, that they hadn't helped their parents when they needed it. There was something that we tried to approach sensitively, because there had been, a certain level of disengagement, or lack of engagement, or lack of seeking help from parents until after the crisis. Chloe was able to identify when we were working with the mother, we were able to identify positive acts that she had taken after crisis, so that she was also caring for her mother, who had a severe and enduring mental illness. She was caring for her adult son, who had substance use issues, and she was also working overnight in a care home prior to the crisis. And through talking about those things, Chloe and her mother were both able to acknowledge the burnout that had led to the crisis. And although Mum wasn't engaging formally with adult mental health services, she was engaging with her GP, and she had taken a number of measures which should be seen as protective factors in terms of moving forward and future risk assessment. Chloe herself felt that in these discussions that she had been referred to TSS for support with her own mental health, and she hadn't planned on engaging. And it was through doing this initial piece of work that halfway through, unfortunately this work was interrupted by COVID, but Chloe did agree to engage. That on the basis of the initial sessions with the family model, Chloe then agreed that she would engage with TSS, and part of that was the better understanding of her own parents' mental health problems and the intergenerational nature of it, things that happened to them as children that didn't get addressed. Chloe then decided, as a 15-year-old who had been informed with this information, she decided that she was going to engage. And some of it took away the stigma as well. So in terms of then, so that was, as I said, one of maybe 5 or 6 different sheets where Chloe was taking the lead in either setting goals or identifying the areas that were most important to her. And this is kind of my own analysis of it, where in each section she's able to acknowledge that her goal is to return home. She's glad her brother is safe with her carers. She's able to identify her own strengths, and she's less worried about everyone. And that was a huge factor for her. If you think of this young 15-year-old girl, she was caring for, before crisis or in the midst of crisis, she was caring for her 8-year-old brother. She was worried about the mental health and suicidality of her father due to the intergenerational trauma that he had suffered. She was worried about her mum's mental health because she was able to see it on a daily basis and identify the warning signs. So, as I said there, I've already talked about the protective factors that we were able to identify, and as we talk about the interconnected arrows, that she was able to recognise that children's services had enabled some of those protective factors. With regards to risk factors and stressors, she was able to identify that not engaging can sometimes increase the risks and the stressors, and that led to her agreeing to engage. So after this, we came away with some questions which informed later assessments. So what will it take for Chloe to get home, and what does mum need to do, and what do I need to do? And then for the support plan, there was, in terms of where decisions would be made, there was the plan for lack attendance, there was advocacy discussed, goal setting as part of overall care planning. That Chloe said she had a complaint with her social worker at that time, and that was she was given due consideration for that, and we supported her with it. And continuing to build living skills and plan for supporting mum, and the Young Carers Project was also considered. So this is, back I think a year or two ago, there was a prevalence study as discussed, and Chloe and Angela agreed to do a video to talk about their experience of the family model, and we'll just play it here. So just watching that again, it's reminded me of an important part of the process was identifying as a member of the Belfast Trust the trauma that Chloe identified as the main trauma that she experienced was separation from her family. And it was important to acknowledge that. Over the course of the work we did with Chloe, she was able to accept that it needed to happen. And Angela was able to accept that as well. But hearing that spoken and having that acknowledged and having that discussed at length during a session such as a family model session was very important to Chloe and very important to Angela, and it enabled a better reflection on all of the situations that occurred to the family in that time. As I said, it was interrupted by COVID. Chloe and Angela did return to living together in a family assessment centre for a period of time, and they're currently living together in their own home, leaving and aftercare services because of the protracted nature in terms of our assessment of what would benefit. I am still involved in discussions with Chloe's transition into leaving and aftercare services as a result of looking to help Chloe avoid the intergenerational trauma, to help her with, in terms of early intervention, to engage in with the services and supports that will be available to her. So reinforcing that work from the family model. And she was very intelligent and very empathetic. And when you talk about feedback, we weren't aware of this, but it was definitely the family model and the informal nature of it. Chloe, under her own steam, decided to write to the manager of the residential home that she was in and basically said that all of the people that she had come into contact with in various residential care units would benefit from the Think Family work, and she wrote that under her own back and asked for that to be sent so that it could be considered for everyone. So